More and more of us are becoming aware of this idea of spiritual awakening. But what does the actual experience of a spiritual awakening, and what is it actually like? Whilst many of us may have this preconception that this is a lovely serene experience, more often than not, the truth of the matter is something different, something scary and uncertain and confronting, which is where the term spiritual emergency has come from. This week I had the great privilege of being able to speak with Jules Evans just about the nature and characteristics of spiritual emergencies. As well as being a practical philosopher, Jules is also the co-editor of a book, Breaking Open, which researches spiritual emergencies. So in this conversation, we really managed to we had a great discussion about the characteristics and some of the surrounding mechanics and dynamics of spiritual emergencies. Now, I believe that this is a really, really important conversation to have right now, particularly as you'll find out in the discussion, given that some of the surrounding things that are happening in society can cause and trigger spiritual emergencies within us. But I also think it's really, really important because more and more I'm seeing people go to yoga and meditation and sound healing and try dabbling with psychedelic drugs, which is all amazing stuff. But the moment you decide to go and do something like that, you are consciously opening the door to the possibility of having a spiritual emergency. And I believe that there's need for more conversation to normalize and map out what exactly is happening during these experiences. Which leads me to another point. If you won't listen to this podcast and you resonate with the contents of it and would like to participate in a small research study and speak to me, and you're based in WA, then please can you reach out, because I'd like to hear about your spiritual emergency experience. So enjoy, Jules. Hello and welcome back to WA Real. I'm your host, Bryn Edwards. Today I have the great pleasure of welcoming Jules Evans to the show. Jules, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know, Jules is over in England, in Bristol. You are a writer, speaker, research fellow, particularly in the world of practical philosophy. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think I wrote something. I think it's from my website, so it better be.
Pretty much, yeah. That's yeah. Well, it wasn't just from your website that I found you, but always like to get it right. Just quickly, without sort of diving too far, why do you feel the need to stick practical in front of philosophy?
I think people get very put off the word philosophy. I mean, in some ways, maybe it's a bit rich, me calling myself a philosopher, in that, I don't have a PhD. I'm interested in ideas and how they can help or harm people's lives.
Yes.
And I also have a natural interest in the history of ideas. So I love tracing some idea that's big in our culture at the moment. Like, where did that come from? How did that, so I love to trace that. But the practical is just, unfortunately, when philosophy became an academic discipline about a century ago, it said, right, we want to prove that we're almost like a science. So what we'll do is we'll make ourselves incomprehensible to ordinary people. This will be the test that we're genuine discipline. Yes. And we'll have these journals that will be, and it's still the case that unfortunately, just philosophy's had a really bad century, I would say. Ever since it became an academic discipline. So by saying practical, you're trying to say, don't be put off. This isn't going to be boring. This isn't going to be incomprehensible. This is going to be useful. And it's unfortunate that you have to kind of make that clear, but that's the state of play.
It's interesting because I find more and more now for myself as I connect into my own inner compass and who I am in the world. And I feel like at the age of 45, I'm starting to get a little bit of a grip on that. That understanding my own philosophy and my own direction and finding that by listening to how others actually, what is good for some people, what is bad for some people, and what is their grip on reality. It helps me to refine my own and gives me more direction at a time when many things out there in the world that we would normally cling on to for a sense of identity are becoming less stable.
Yes, quite.
Super. So one of the the reason why I wanted to really speak to you today was very much around your work that you've been doing recently with spiritual emergencies, and particularly your book, Breaking Open, which you did with Tim Reed. Just to set the context for this, whilst I myself have had what I've referred to as sort of existential dissolving experiences over the last couple of years, also in the podcast, I've had a very rich thread of inquiry over the last 2 months, which has sort of come about, where I've really sort of delved into the mechanics and dynamics of what it is to be a human navigating through the human experience and life. And that's included diving into narcissism as an organizing principle with Professor Sam Vaknin, looking at core trauma, looking at codependency with the likes of Richard Grannon, speaking to a local Jungian analyst who we really touched on opening up to the numinous and having numinous experiences. And then recently with sort of a quite a spiritual leader here in Australia, Darpan, and we started talking about spiritual bypassing and how it's a great way to avoid things. And I guess as I look around here in Western Australia, I'm starting to see more and more people. It's been happening for a while, but it's seeing more and more people set against the changeable context of COVID and things like that. But more and more people are going to cacao ceremonies and breath work and ice bath and yoga and then all the way through to psychedelics and ayahuasca. And so there's a real want to focus inwards and journey inwards. And I guess just even through my own experience and speaking to some of those close to me, there's that great meme that, what you think a spiritual enlightenment is going to look like, and there's a lovely, woman there sitting on a beach like this. What it's really like is you under the duvet going, what the fuck is going on? And as more and more people, particularly here in WA, start to, I guess for me, every time you decide to go and do something of that ilk, you are consciously inviting a spiritual awakening to happen. And for me, it's not something we talk about very much. It's not very normalized. There isn't that many maps about for this. And there certainly isn't much support. I mean, as I just sort of briefly said to you beforehand, when it happened to me, I drew on my boarding school resilience and just took myself away and locked myself in a box because that's what I do, but that's not for everybody. So what I really wanted to do is speak to somebody who has done some research and investigated this, because I think it's really important. Is that kind of how you got into this? I'd be interested to know.
I wrote a book. So the first book I wrote was about how people use stoicism in modern life, which is a very rational approach to resilience and flourishing. And at the end of that book, I was like, stoicism misses some things out. It misses out. Perhaps there's a risk of it being over rational and over individualistic. Yes. It misses out the importance of things like connection to other people. It misses out non-rational states of consciousness and all their importance in human existence. It misses out the arts and dancing and partying and romantic love. So there's a lot that it misses out. And a lot of that you could define as the kind of the ecstatic. So, when I looked at ancient Greek culture, which was, an inspiration for me in my 20s, and I really kind of dived into it, they balance the rational and the non-rational. They balance the Socratic, like Socrates, and the Dionysiac, Dionysus, the god of ecstasies. They had both in Greek culture. So I wrote a second book, and it was looking at how people find moments of ecstasy in modern culture. Ecstasy comes from the ancient Greek ekstasis, a moment when you go beyond your ordinary self and feel connected to something bigger than you. Yes. We think of ecstasy as meaning very, very happy, but actually, as you know, the ecstatic can be terrifying. You are beyond your usual customary kind of, comfort zone of who you are. And so that's really scary, being kind of out of your head, out of your, well, it can be anyway. So an ecstatic experience can be both euphoric and also frightening. So in that book, which is called The Art of Losing Control, I just looked at the different ways people can find ecstasy today in a culture that's to some extent still quite suspicious of and hostile to ecstasy, as a consequence of like the Enlightenment, and as a consequence of 19th century and 20th century psychiatry, which tended to define ecstatic experiences as delusional and pathological.
Yes.
Any non-rational states of consciousness are suspect and delusional. So that's the kind of main picture. But then, as you said, there are these subcultures like spiritual culture, ecstatic Christianity. Previously there have been things like romanticism or Methodism, which actively sought the ecstatic, and kind of and really fetishized them in a way, and thought that ecstatic experiences were the most important experiences a human could have, and you should go and seek them. So in that book, The Art of Losing Control, I mentioned a little bit about spiritual emergencies.
Yeah.
I did a couple of pages on it, basically saying there is some research on how ecstatic experiences can be quite messy and quasi-psychotic sometimes.
Yeah.
And how to help people through them. So I did a little bit on the dark side of it. I also did things on, how people find ecstatic experiences through violence and war, which isn't much talked about in the kind of new age scene, but it's huge historically. That's hunting and fighting is such a route to ecstatic experiences for humans.
Almost Fight Club.
Yeah, and war, and and just hunting as well. Like, you think about the long human history, hunting in a pack would have been such a kind of high. What then happened was that book came out. As part of writing that book, I looked at some of the new psychedelic research coming out over the last 10 years, from Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Lab, from Imperial College, from Australia now, from Zurich. There's been quite a few papers saying psychedelic therapy is wonderful for people. It helps you, overcome your fear of death, overcome chronic depression, stop you smoking, cure you of PTSD, and it will be the most meaningful experience of your life. So I, like everyone else, am reading these things going, this sounds amazing. Maybe it's time I try psychedelics again. By the reason I started this whole journey was that I did a lot of psychedelics when I was a teenager. Yeah. And then I had a couple of bad trips, which kind of traumatized me because I didn't talk to anyone about them and didn't ask for help or anything like that. So that's what got me into philosophy and stoicism and all this stuff to try to heal myself. But 20 years on, reading all this new psychedelic research, I thought, I would like to try psychedelic therapy again, but in a safe context, in what they call a held space, one of his favorite kind of spiritual phrases. And I thought, because I just thought that might help heal me at a kind of deeper level. Stoicism had massively helped me, but there's the rational maybe can only get so far. Like there might be kind of subliminal kind of trauma, and I thought maybe psychedelics in a safe space would help me down there. So I went to, and I'll finish the story soon. So after The Art of Losing Control came out, I went to do an ayahuasca retreat in the Amazon. And it was at a place called the Temple of the Way of Light, 10-day retreat, 5 ceremonies. And it was really extraordinary to go back into that psychedelic space. And to tell the truth, I mean, this was powerful stuff. I'd never done ayahuasca before. I'd never done psychedelics in the context of a shamanic ritual before, with shamans singing and things. And it was pretty amazing. But in the week after that retreat, I had a kind of messy fallout from it. And I wasn't expecting it. I thought it might be scary on the retreat. And it was a bit, but I wasn't expecting it to come up, for all these, for me to get into mental difficulties after the retreat when I was no longer on ayahuasca.
Yeah.
So for about 5 days, for let's say 5 to 10 days on and off, I was in a very dissociated state where I felt I'm not in normal reality. Like this is I'm in some kind of altered reality, and my mind was desperately trying to figure out what kind of reality I was in. I was like, I think I'm in a dream, or maybe I'm dead and in a coma, and this is like limbo or something like that. So, and unfortunately, because I was traveling on my own, I didn't have anyone to just check in with.
Yeah.
And for them to say, no, Jules, you've just been on an ayahuasca retreat for 10 days. That's what you're high. So I was just like, you know, and it was very unnerving, of course, because I wasn't on drugs at the time. I'd been on drugs before, and it didn't go away. Even when I went to sleep and woke up again, I'd be like, oh shit, I'm still in this dream. So can you imagine like that feeling of being like in a dream for several days? And I didn't freak out. I was like, I'll just have to go along with it. But all this weird stuff was happening as well, which always confirmed to me like, oh yeah, you're in a dream or something. And then finally I got home and from the Amazon and or from South America, and my friends kind of just looked out for me, and after a few days I was totally fine. But that is what got me interested deeper in this topic, and I thought, how can we best support people who have an experience like that, and not traumatize them further if they get into kind of weird spaces, you know, whether on a meditation retreat or after psychedelics or just, you know, after yoga or just spontaneously. How can we help people and not just go, you're crazy and you'll always be crazy?
Yes.
Which is how psychiatry can sometimes, you know, if I'd gone to see a psychiatrist, there is a real risk they'd have said to me, okay, you've got this, and that's for life, and therefore you've got to take this medication for life. And that would have fucked me up, you know, like that would have been bad. So what can we do to better understand this kind of experience and to support people through it?
So coming out of your subjective experience and looking at this sort of more objectively, what typically characterizes a spiritual awakening or spiritual emergency, would you say?
Well, so an ecstatic experience or a spiritual experience, as I said, is a moment when people go beyond their everyday self-construction.
Yeah.
And that's somehow or other kind of dissolves, or there's a window through it. Our everyday selves are kind of cobbled together over the years through beliefs and habits and expectations, and they do the job like a cobbled together car of kind of getting us through the day. But there's a lot more to us than that. There's consciousness is bigger. A lot of it's subconscious. You know, we access that world in our dreams every night, and you see the kind of weird mythical way our minds are, you know, our subconsciouses work. But also there can be wisdom there as well, and there can be healing. So what happens in a positive and kind of easy spiritual experience is that kind of cobbled together self, you know, either dissolves, or there's a chink that you can see through it, and you know, you feel like blissfully connected, perhaps to, I don't know, to the cosmos, and you feel like just everything's as it should be. Maybe you see everything anew. It's what a lot of poets talk about, like, seeing the world afresh. Look at that flower, it's so beautiful, you know. Or like there's people like on psychedelics as well, like Aldous Huxley famously stared at his grey flannel trousers and just thought, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And so they see the world anew. Their eyes are cleansed from habit. And that's all lovely. You know, a spiritual emergency is when you go beyond your ordinary sense of ordinary ego construction, or it dissolves or something. But and it can be both beautiful, but it's also scary. And it's an extended thing where, for some reason or other, it's like it's difficult to just kind of come back into the spaceship, as it were.
Yeah.
So there's a difficult re-entry. And you basically can get into a kind of extended, altered state of reality,
Right.
where it doesn't just last for a day, but it maybe last for like several days or weeks or months. And it can involve things like, you know, mania, or the positive side of that is intense energy. You
Yes.
might not sleep for days or weeks. You might see kind of, you know, patterns and hidden meanings in everything. The inner world and the outer world blend together. So the kind of dream world and the outer world start overlapping. And
Yeah.
you might see kind of start thinking in mythical terms. People can, archetypal material from the subconscious can spill out. So
Yeah.
people can start thinking like that they are divine, and you know, but interpret it in a certain way, like they are uniquely divine,
Yes.
like they are Jesus, or they
The
are,
next
you
coming.
know, Ishtar. Yeah, and they'll start thinking apocalyptically, because what happens is like you're in a stage where your old ego has, as it were, died,
Yeah.
and something new has come into its place, and you can interpret that cosmically as the death of the old world and
Mm.
the birth of a new world. And really, you know, it's more like just personal. However, what I noticed in the research I've done is sometimes the personal and the macrocosmic interact. So during political crises, people are more prone to spiritual emergencies. Like
Yes.
in this book I wrote, which gathered together 14 people's stories of spiritual emergencies. One was triggered during Brexit. One woman had a kind of spiritual emergency, and it was triggered by Brexit. I've come across other stories during the pandemic of people who've been like, you know,
Yeah.
we're in a fevered state, all of us at the moment.
Yeah.
And
Just so we're clear, this isn't just psychedelics. This can happen just by
Yeah.
interacting with the environment.
Well, yeah. And like, you know, we're in a bit of a collective spiritual emergency at the moment of the
Mm.
dissolving of the old, the dissolving of the habitual, a
Yeah.
sense of hyperconnectedness, a sense of both kind of, you know, possibility of the new, but also the sense of, oh, is this the end times? And so,
Yeah.
um, and also the flooding of mythical, magical thinking and conspiracies, this kind of stuff from the outer edges are flooding into the mainstream. So
Yeah.
we're in that kind of collective state. So it's like that, and it can be very scary for people, because often they'll be like, God, I just went on a yoga retreat, or I just you know, tried LSD for the weekend. I wasn't expecting, you know, the dissolution of my world for like several weeks or months. And they're having to kind of try and find their way in a culture which we don't have many maps or
Mm.
guides or words for this domain of experience, because we're supposedly super rational. So they're having to kind of, they're having this, they're also in a culture where if they asked for help, they might get psychiatric help, which would fit their experience into a very narrow materialist box,
Yes.
and ignore what they might feel is the kind of meaningful or even beautiful aspects of their experience.
Yeah.
So these kind of experiences are unnervingly ambiguous. They both can feel very meaningful and kind of beautiful and hyper-connected, but they can also feel terrifying and painful. What we found in our research is people are more prone for their spiritual experience to be a messy spiritual emergency if they've had trauma in their youth,
Right.
because what's basically happened is they've gone beyond their usual ego shell,
Yeah.
and that's both wonderful, but also the dark stuff comes out too. And that's
Yes.
definitely what happened with me. Like old trauma came out, and is like, so it involves that kind of confrontation with traumatic or shadow stuff.
Yeah, because I guess, uh, like I said, there's been a thread in the podcast and on my own experiences. We create these protective, for me, a strategic protective persona, and I guess on one level, it takes a lot of energy to run those personas. And after 20, 25 years, I just wonder whether there's a part of us that just goes, fuck, I'm tired now.
Yeah.
And it looks for a safe place to just go, I think we'll sleep, and just go to one side. And then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
all these things started to happen for me. I suddenly felt
Yeah.
tired, and then poof, poof, it was happening. The world
Yeah.
seemed very dreamy,
Yeah.
and you know, I just wanted, you know, like when you come back from holiday and it's still a little bit
Yeah.
dreamy, but you just think, oh,
Yeah.
I'll do this, this, and this, and I'll be back into gear, and off I'll go.
Yeah.
I just couldn't find the gears. And
Yeah.
then after a while, this happened sort of frequently. I gave up trying to find the gears.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I
Well, that's,
began to ease into it, but
yeah. I mean, I think what I found, what we found in our research was a lot of time people were talking about experiences that had happened to them in their 20s, and they really didn't have the kind of wherewithal to deal with it. They often had no kind of spiritual training, so they were flung into the deep end of some complete ego dissolution experience, and they're going, what the hell is
yes.
happening? And they kind of just had to patch themselves up and get through. And it wasn't really resolved or integrated. And then sometimes they came back to that kind of messy place in their late 30s or so, and were a bit more able to kind of cope with it. But yeah, for me, it was like, it was around the time I turned 40. And I just, in terms of what you were saying, I think that kind of shedding of personae and that kind of like is quite a midlife thing. I mean, I don't know if 40 is midlife, but like, I think there's a good Brené Brown quote, which is like, you spend the first 40 years constructing armor and the next 40 years kind of trying to take it down. But yeah, as you said, there's the kind of dreamy aspect of it, because, you know, what you call going through the gears, that's the kind of normal ego trance that we're in. I'm this person, and this person does this, this, and this, and that's the day. And then when you know, and then in one of these moments, yeah, you kind of just go off those usual rails, and it creates this fluid numinous state. But it's both a bit scary, because there's literally like, I don't know who I am, because if I'm not that usual habitual person, then who am I? But it also, that dreamy fluidity creates the space for change as well. So this is, I suppose this is the main message of these of this book, Breaking Open, is like, other people have gone through this. Here's it, you know, you're not alone. Here's what they found helpful in terms of the kind of wisdom practices that steered them through. And particularly what they found helpful was a frame, which is, this is not just a breakdown. This can be like the transition to something else. This doesn't have to be the end of your life. This doesn't mean you're on the scrap heap of the rational enlightened society. This can be a transition to a new you. And you know, who knows, better, worse, but definitely a new you, like you know, this can be the transition to something else where you know, which also has kind of meaning and flourishing to it. So that's the kind of, that's in some ways the main message of the book. Like, don't be totally freaked out if this happens. This happens to other people as well. You can learn ways to steer through this kind of experience.
And already you earlier on used words like wisdom and healing. So there is that going on.
Yeah, that's right. And the people in Breaking Open that we spoke to, they often drew on quite similar things to help them through. Like, when you're in a very altered state, you can be quite detached from your body and from material reality, and quite kind of in a like a bit of a transcendent, you know, dreamy state. So a lot of people talked about grounding themselves in their body and in material reality. One contributor, when she was really in a very altered state, she said what really helped her was she went apple picking in a friend's orchard, and for several days just worked incredibly hard picking apples, and that just kind of tired out her mind to stop it really racing around, and it grounded her in her body. And I remember for me, when I came back from the Amazon and was also in a very weird, altered, ghostly state, like sitting in front of my brother's fire with his dog, like stroking his dog, that was so grounding, because it was just like the fire and the dog and like a, you know, a cup of tea or something like that. So getting in touch with one's body, and also like learning to control your fear and anxiety with your breath is very helpful, because I would get these waves of anxiety and feeling like, am I going to come back from this? And I would learn to kind of breathe and calm myself down, and I would say to myself things like, this will pass.
Yeah.
Don't worry, this will pass. Because the thing that can really take you down the rabbit hole is if you start thinking it's going to be like this forever. It's
like this forever.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the worst thing you could say to yourself on a trip as well. The alternative is just say like, this will pass. Everything passes. So I'm going to be okay. So that kind of thing, and like practicing kindness to oneself, even when you're really not fulfilling your idea of a kind of normal functioning, ego. Just going, okay, that's just what's happening. That's what's happening at the moment. So I'm going to be kind to myself and let myself have this kind of, fall apart moment, and trust that, good stuff will come from it. Because we can be, again, what can really mess people up is they're in a messy experience, and then they just really beat themselves up for not fulfilling their normal ego function model.
Super ego will come in and start to tell you, this is what you should be doing. This is what we're normally doing.
Yeah, exactly. And just let it go. It's not going to last forever. Just kind of go with it for a bit. Keep yourself safe. Be kind to yourself.
I guess
yeah,
there's another bit in there about the people that you have around you, because to actually share, I mean, you're at your most vulnerable point when you've let go of, you're letting go, or you've let go, or you've been letted go. If there is such a active verb of that. But you're at your most vulnerable point, and friends, work colleagues, even family members will have a perception of, Bryn or Jules like this, and all of a sudden you're like that. And you actually let go and just say, look, I am in a state here, and this is what
I mean, like, so the first, when I was 18, and I had a bad acid trip at a party where I didn't really know anybody, and I didn't trust them, I guess. And I felt pretty paranoid, and I left it still in a very altered state, and I went home to my parents' place, and I didn't trust them to talk about it, because I didn't think they would understand, and I didn't talk to anyone about it, and that really, that made it much worse. That made what was a bad trip turn into a kind of traumatic event, which I didn't recover from for several years. When this happened to me this time, when I was 40, and in some ways I think it was the return of that old trauma. I could not go and hide away, partly because I'd rented out my flat on Airbnb, so I had to rely on my brother and my friends, and luckily they were also in their kind of 40s, and some of them had messy experiences, so they were great at taking care of me, but trusting I'd be all right, and it was amazing that kind of week when they were looking out for me, or maybe it was a bit more, maybe it was like, it was a week or 10 days or so. It was in some ways it was beautiful, like it was a beautiful time, and my friends said the same. Like, my heart was really open, but I was also quite out there. Like, I couldn't understand books. They would show movies to me, and I couldn't really follow the movies. Like, I mean, I remember they showed me the Blues Brothers. They were like, oh, it's one of his favorite movies. This will help ground him. But there was a scene in it which I'd never seen before, and I thought, oh, this isn't real. This is a figment of my imagination. And it turned out it was like the director's cut, so it had these scenes in it which were like, but I was just like, what's this scene? But they were great, and it was just like to know that I could trust my friends in that state, and that they saw me, really hardly without any mask on at all. I mean, I was just in this kind of, I suppose, like, child state of just my heart being very open, but being quite cognitively disabled. And that was fantastic. And people in the book, like, one of the contributors, she went to when she was in a real mess, she went to a nunnery. She kind of took retreat in a nunnery. The sisters, she said, just were very patient and loving and supportive of her when she was feeling so kind of raw and such a mess. I suppose some others might find that, you know, I had a friend who had just went through a kind of midlife ego dissolution, and she more like went on retreat herself. So she, you know, so that I suppose people have different things that work for themselves. So she, you know, she was more solitary, I guess. Anyway, yes, certainly in my case, like my friends and the kind of setting was super important.
Yeah. Since doing the research, publishing the book, being very open about that, have you? I mean, it's always one of those things. If you go actively looking for things, you go and find them. But has that sort of created more impetus, or have you noticed more impetus for people to start normalizing the discussion around this now?
Maybe a bit.
It's probably still got a bit of a way to go in the UK, but
in the world, there's very little discussion about this.
Yeah.
What's strange is if you do start talking about it, people will quietly say, yes, I had something like that. I went through something like this and I haven't told anyone about it. So I hear that quite a lot. Or people will say, oh, I went through that and I've never heard any kind of description of it. And that's that, you know, but I can tell you that, you know, even within like psychedelic communities, there's not very much on spiritual emergencies. Even within meditation communities, there's only one research project of all the studies on mindfulness. There's only one research project on difficult meditation experiences.
Yeah.
On, you know, people who go on retreats and they go into kind of quasi-psychotic states. So, or take kind of, you know, personal transformation courses like Landmark or Hoffman. You know, I don't think there's hardly any research on the fact that a small proportion of people go into psychotic states after going on one of these weekend intensive courses. So there's extremely little on it, unfortunately. I mean, like, so we brought this, but there is some. There, you know, there's definitely some, and there are these kind of communities and networks like the Spiritual Crisis Network, the Spiritual Emergence Network. So there is some. There's an organization called Emerging Proud in the UK. But I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like we're in such a kind of we're in a transition time at the moment as a, you know, as a species, really. And I suppose it is a window where ideas that were normally not part of the mainstream are coming into the mainstream. Yeah. So there's a kind of breakdown of the ruling narrative, of the ruling myth of just growth and technocratic order. And so I wonder if kind of some ideas, which are basically kind of spiritual ideas, are coming more into the mainstream. There's also, of course, you know, the kind of ruling psychiatric paradigm of there are these neurochemical disorders called things like A, B, and C, which are best treated solely with these drugs. There's a lot of pushback against that kind of narrative at the moment, including among psychiatrists. I mean, my co-editor of the book, Tim Reed, is a psychiatrist. So there are lots of psychiatrists saying, look, you know, we're not really helping people much here. We're kind of just ignoring the meaning of their experience and just giving them kind of sedatives. So I don't know. I mean, we've done kind of some talks and articles and things about the book. And when we do talks about them, like we get a really positive response, but I still think we're a long way from a
Mm.
mainstream newspaper doing an article on spiritual emergencies. I mean,
Yeah.
in the UK, a mainstream newspaper wouldn't even do an article about a spiritual experience, let alone a spiritual emergency. So it's
Yeah.
like, I don't know about what it's like in Australia, but in the UK, our mainstream culture is quite secular and kind of non-transcendent. We're quite just practical, down to earth kind of culture.
Yeah.
So
I guess,
they're
I guess here in Australia, I moved here 10 years ago from
Are
England.
you Australian or British?
I am British, English
Okay.
actually.
Yeah, because your accents are,
Yeah, we should
less
clean
is
that
your
up.
accent,
Yeah.
but there's a bit of
Um,
yeah.
yeah, a bit more slower in things. Um, so I guess where I see it here is there is more legitimization of looking after yourself because we have such an outdoor culture.
Right.
So to go to the gym and there's a lot of people that look physically ripped and things like that. But
Right.
with that, also then is this we're beginning to understand that maybe there's something more there. Maybe there is something around this mental health business, and maybe we should pay attention to the number of people who are committing suicide and things like that, and
Mm.
chronically anxious and depressed. So there's almost like this token bit of, well, take some exercise, consider meditation, almost as
Yeah.
just a throwaway thing. But
Yeah.
that in and of itself is the gateway for me
Mm.
into this. As soon as you start saying,
Yeah.
take yourself more seriously and your well-being and your mental well-being, and I'd like to see the word emotional well-being in there as well.
Mm.
That's the gateway
Yes,
to,
it's interesting. Like what in the 60s would have been called, like, I don't know, new age culture, or consciousness culture,
yeah,
spiritual but not religious, and now it's called wellness culture. So
yes,
there's this idea of like, we're not really going to talk about metaphysics. We're not going to talk about the soul. We're not going to talk about life after death or the grand meaning of life. We're just going to talk about wellness.
yeah.
Completely. Who can argue with wellness? Like,
I
so
know,
just
I know, but
how to
it's
be
still
happy,
sort of,
how to be well.
yeah, but it still sort of stays in that rationalized state,
Yeah,
really.
exactly. And
And
it's kind of it fits quite well with consumerism and with
oh,
capitalism,
and private medical insurance
and
and
health. I mean, gosh, we're so obsessed with health, aren't we? So it's like
exactly,
everyone wants to be, and also it's like, you think about, like, say, the kind of 19th century idea of the or the old idea of the spiritual seeker would be this kind of, someone who's renounced the world,
yeah,
lived in a cave and is very thin, maybe, or if they're an Indian, yogi, they'd be covered in ash or something. But now the kind of wellness influencer, they're absolutely gorgeous. Their body's beautiful,
yeah.
and so they haven't renounced the world at all.
I know,
They're
and
like,
they're probably sitting on a beach with a picture of them on Instagram, sitting on a beach with a crystal, meditating. We
yeah,
get a
oh
lot of
yeah.
those
I mean,
here.
well, sure. If you go to Goa and you go to the beach at sunrise, it's literally about 100 people taking Instagram photos of
Yeah,
themselves doing poses, which is that's fine. And I suppose there's always been an overlap between kind of religion and spirituality and wellness for the last century. You had movements
yeah,
like Christian Science or New Thought. That's just an American thing, I think. Americans are obsessed with
mm,
health and
yeah.
wellness.
So yeah, I mean that's why I was so keen to
But
talk to you. Go on.
But I'm interested. Tell me, like, in Australia, to what extent is the culture open to kind of self-transcendence? To what extent is that a mainstream conversation?
I think if you went onto the TV, which is generally so out, you've got Netflix. The advent of Netflix has meant that TV is just full of reality TV, which is
Yeah,
shite. Let's be honest.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so I guess there's still, I mean, you're talking to me here in Western Australia, there's still a very conservative core to that. But then on the other end of the scale, there are a lot of people who are out there, you know, I'm connected to networks where cacao ceremonies, breathing, ice bath, and yeah, those three, they're very in vogue at the moment, very in vogue. Putting those three together. And there's meditation retreats and
so there's a kind of personal development.
There's a growing
kind of spirituality and so on.
So despite the fact we have this very conservative core, there is this growing and growing and growing like curiosity and wanting to get further into it, which you know, for somebody who's intrinsically curious about the depths of the dynamics of what it is to be a human in the human experience. You know, my nectar is reading Jung and Ken Wilber and people like that. So I can start to see things moving and shifting. And it's like, I think it's brilliant that we're moving towards that, because that's a society that I want to live in. Recognize, you know, as you pointed out, there's a lot of us are carrying trauma and scars that we have. Our psyche is just very cleverly, you know, our personas are very cleverly hidden, and then all of a sudden, when the time's right, out it comes. And I think, as you rightfully said, there's a lot of collective shadow work to be done.
And there can be a naivety within spiritual subcultures about the kind of the dark side of the subconscious and the dark side of opening up beyond your ordinary ego. Like it's not all angels and incense down there. Like there's messy stuff.
There's nasty.
But I think also, I mean, like I think a message I've kind of come back to quite often is like, you know, finding a balance between the rational and critical and the mystical and ecstatic. Like there is a risk in rejecting kind of mainstream rationalist culture. You just kind of, you know, you throw out the baby with the bathwater. Absolutely. And you lose critical thinking. And you even reject the idea of, you know, truth and evidence, and then just say, you know, when you go into altered states of consciousness, it can give you different type of wisdom, but it can also make you prone to, you can be very suggestible. You can, there's a risk of, getting stuck in mythical thinking, and mythical thinking has its role, or magical thinking, but it's also can be prone to distortions as well. You can be prone to kind of cult thinking. Unfortunately, sometimes people go for it. They find ecstatic experiences within a certain community, which feels wonderful. They feel so kind of bonded to the people in that community. They feel like this is my true family. It kind of brings up this infant stuff of like, oh, my actual family are rubbish, but this family is wonderful. And the leaders of this community are my perfect mother or father. And you know, what we saw all through the kind of 70s up to the present day is the risks of that. When you're finding ecstatic states within a kind of little community, which maybe isn't necessarily that safe, and you know, when you join it, it seems absolutely beautiful and wonderful, but actually it has hidden authoritarian dynamics within it. So, and I think there's another risk which I see now is like, in this collective breakdown, we are more prone to magical solutions and to magical and mythical thinking, you know, like, that's not all bad, like to kind of be able to shift to different types of thinking, but it can be if you start looking for magical solutions in the realm of politics. So, you know, like I don't know, I think in Australia and in the UK and in the US, I don't know if you've seen kind of some kind of quite extreme conspiracy theories spreading, quite quickly through like wellness and spirituality networks.
Yes.
Like I mean, I saw it at the start of April. People questioning, like, of course, a lot of people in the spiritual communities are anti-vax, and they're pro-alternative medicine and all that kind of stuff. And they're also suspicious of kind of the state and lockdowns. Okay, I'm not going to get into a big argument about vaccines, but then you saw this kind of QAnon conspiracy also spreading through wellness communities. And basically that is, to me, a very kind of magical thinking. It's like there's a secret occult group who are, liberal pedophiles, and they're ritually sacrificing children, and they're controlling the world. That is an example to me of like dangerous magical thinking. And if only Trump the Messiah will save us, everything will go back to an age of love. So this is almost a kind of millenarian, almost a kind of medieval theory. This is why in altered states and in altered times, you need to keep your critical discrimination.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're basically going to become hijacked by a myth. You will be possessed by a myth, and you'll just become a Q-bot, like a kind of just like you'll be radicalized basically, and become basically a zombie.
I guess having watched the Social Dilemma movie on Netflix only just recently, there's somebody who's going through a spiritual emergency, who is in a very suggestible state, who's had this numinous energy brought into them, and they're all and you've only got to click on one new video or new link or pay attention to a radical friend's post that bit longer. And we've, from if Social Dilemma is to be believed, and I suspect it is, then immediately you're going to be fed more and 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 more.
And each one that pops up, you're going to think, oh, it's a sign.
like you said, one of the key symptoms being seeing signs and seeing collections and things like that.
Yeah.
You're just going to be fed more and more and more and more, which so maybe part of helping out your friend in a spiritual emergency is take the fucking phone off.
Absolutely, yeah. Because when you're, when you're in a frightening state where your old beliefs have melted, you just very much can be looking for certainty. Like, give me another story, give me something to hold on to, because I feel like I'm drowning. And so it's, you've got to be very careful in that you don't end up holding the wrong story, just seizing onto it. And like, the story might be like, oh, I'm the Messiah. That's what David Icke thought. You know who I mean by David Icke?
Yeah. Oh, I know exactly who you mean. You go back and watch the original Wogan, and there it is.
Yeah. And he had a kind of spiritual emergency, I think, where he thought, I feel divine and connected to all things. But the world's going to end, but I'm going to tell everybody. And he went on Wogan, and the nation laughed at him.
Yeah, I remember.
And then he went down this very dark rabbit hole of, it's all an evil conspiracy with kind of lizard people. And unfortunately, that kind of found resonance with an audience. So he's now had to kind of stick to that story for like 30 years or something. But I guess the point is that in that fluid state, just to try and not just grasp hold of the first magical narrative you come across, but often it's our beliefs and our need for certainty that mess us up. Like, can we stay grounded in uncertainty? Like, we have this experience, and it's both beautiful and it's also quite painful, and it has some meaning to it, but there's also a bit of who the fuck knows? Like, I mean, like, I do not, like, it's okay to say, I do not know precisely what's going on in the spiritual world. I'm not exactly sure the nature of the divine. That is totally okay to say that, and also, like, politics. I'm not even entirely sure what's going on globally politically. That's okay too. No one is. I've met leading kind of political thinkers and politicians. They don't know what the fuck's going on either. So you don't have to have one global theory about the nature of, you know, the divine, the political, and everything. It's okay not to know. You know what I mean?
I think I've spoken about my own. I did a presentation about this not so long ago about my own addiction to knowing things.
Yeah.
And I think I tracked it back to almost like when you have original source trauma. You don't know what's going on. You feel out of control, and you have these nasty things called emotions that come up. So then you create a persona which is in control and knows things and suppresses these things. So immediately we need to know, and then that persona just goes off, and to just sit there and go, I haven't got a fucking clue who I am right now.
Yeah.
I really don't know who I am.
You look, if we compare now to like the 20s and 30s, people got seduced by grand theories, you know, that explained everything, like Marxism and fascism, and these were kind of magical solutions, magical total solutions. And we lost the messy middle. So can we kind of stay in that messy middle of not sure, but this is kind of, you know, this isn't you know, going to create an age of love, but this might kind of, you know, make it a little less bad and a little bit better. So that just kind of, you know, the politics of the practical. No, but it is tough, and like we can be even, you know, even kind of even a very negative story is sometimes less scary than being unsure about what's going on.
Yes.
Like we sometimes get, even if we have a very negative story about ourselves or about the world, at least it's familiar. Yes. You know, it's better than admitting I'm not really sure, I don't know. I mean, I saw that when I was in a support group for people who had social anxiety when I was in my early 20s. People would really cling to their negative beliefs that, you know, like, for example, I'm a loser and I have no friends. They would really cling to that because it was familiar.
Yeah. Anxiety was their friend.
Yeah.
Faithful companion.
Yeah, exactly.
Two last quick questions, because I know you got a busy self off to pre-lockdown. Britain. Without disappearing into wishful thinking, do you think there's also a role here that not only are we sort of individually as, dare I say it, nodes opening up to spiritual emergencies, but also do you think there's I explored this with a Jungian analyst that psyche, or the self, capital T, capital S, is starting to emerge more, which will force more of the spiritual emergencies. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not just us, it's collective us.
I don't know. I'm open to the possibility. I think like people have been in New Age spirituality have been saying a massive paradigm shift is upon us any day now. They've been saying that for a century. So, for example, in the kind of 1890s, you had psychical researchers who, you know, investigated like spiritualism and seances. And they thought that within 10, 20 years, every human would be functionally telepathic, and that communication between the dead and the living would be like you and me communicating now. It would be like Zoom. And they thought, and then in the 60s, certainly people thought that there was a mass spiritual awakening happening, and that, I mean, Ram Dass and Timothy Leary thought the whole of America would become enlightened in a matter of months. And then in the 90s, people thought the same. And then in 2012, with the kind of, you know, harmonic convergence and the Mayan calendar. So, you know, I wrote an article called "Dude, Where's My Paradigm Shift?" Like about like, you know, where's this grand spiritual awakening that we've been told that is happening any year now. But nonetheless, there is data that shows more and more people say they've had a spiritual experience. like since 1960. You can look at data that shows like it's like more than doubled in America. So I don't know if you know, I'm wary of the idea that we're going to shift to some kind of age of love, you know, that kind of millenarian type expectation, because it's always a bit messy. But at the same time, you know, there are these grand cultural and spiritual movements that happen throughout history. And so spirit, as it were, is unpredictable, and extraordinary things do happen.
That's why I like asking this question at the moment.
Yeah, so it is never quite what one expects as well. So and it's never entirely good either. It's always like a bit of a mixed bag. But I'm sure that I don't think humans are going to go extinct. Though on a bad day you think, you know, but so something you know is going to emerge. Something new and extraordinary is going to emerge on this kind of adventure. I hope that it'll be this kind of balance of the critical rational and the kind of numinous. But I wouldn't bet against some kind of, you know, more dark fundamentalist kind of thing taking hold in some bits of the world. And you know, unfortunately, I see extremist politics rising on right and left, particularly in the States. So I'm not sure. I suspect we're going into a period where we're not going to have one kind of grand myth, but several quite different kind of cultures, with quite different realities, which is unfortunate because we need some kind of we're facing global problems like the pandemic or, you know, climate change, which require us all to work together. So it's unfortunate that we are losing any kind of collective myth or collective belief system, and instead we're the mushrooming of different realities.
Last question I ask all my guests is a hypothetical one, but I always find it fun, is if you could upload a single question into the collective consciousness, so everybody just sat still and considered it for 7 or 8 minutes, what would that be?
Well, I suppose I suppose I reckon the most interesting question that we don't sit with enough is who am I? Because I think if you follow that question, it can take you beyond kind of narrow egocentricity. And I suppose in some ways I feel like, and this might be wrong, is that the meaning of life is to try and kind of wake up to our deeper identity, which is kind of collective and spiritual and connected to the natural world. So my hope is if but I don't know, I think if people just sat with it for 9 minutes, I'm not sure what would change, but I think that's the most interesting question. And what fascinates me about it is I still don't entirely know the answer. So I'm still kind of, well, of course I don't, you know, so I think that probably is what everyone says, isn't it?
No.
No.
Okay. Jules, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you today. I think more than anything, it highlights the need for conversations exactly like the one we've had today. And if it begins to just normalize it for a handful of people who watch this conversation, I'm keen to, here in WA, I'm keen to do a little bit more research and try and harvest some of the stories in a similar way that you did over in the UK. Just because, for all the reasons that I wanted to talk to you today and I outlined today, I see more and more people wanting to go down this path, which is great. But I just think we need to be able to have a few bits of material and support out there So when it happens, and not just for the individual, but for the community as well. So,
Absolutely. And I think also, like, it's not just happening in spiritual communities as well. It will also happen in Christian communities and Muslim communities. So there's also an interesting thing about how do different cultures make sense of this? What can we learn from each other?
yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if people want to find you and your work, where do they go to?
My website is philosophyforlife.org. I got a free kind of newsletter, which I recommend people sign up for. And then this book about spiritual emergencies is called Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergency.
Yeah, I've got a copy on order at the moment. So there you go. Jules,
Great.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryn.